Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to imagine something. You're standing at the rostra, right in the Roman Forum. It's the absolute center of the world.
Hmm.
The year is 114 BC. It's the late Republic. And you can feel this collective anxiety in the air. The city's on edge. There are military failures happening far away. Political bitterness is getting worse and worse at home.
Right. The whole system is starting to feel fragile.
Exactly. And then the crowd parts. And there's this deep, profound silence. Every single eye is fixed on a sight that's so terrible it's almost unbearable to watch.
A covered litter.
A covered litter draped in black, and it's not being carried towards a funeral pyre. It's heading for the city walls.
And inside that litter is a woman. Her name is Amelia. She's not in her famous white robes. She's in burial clothes. And her hair, the famous 6 braids, the sequins, they're undone. It's a signal of total disgrace.
Her crime, incestum.
The breaking of her sacred vow of chastity. The pontiffs have judged her, and this ancient, truly horrific punishment is already in motion.
She isn't going to a standard place of execution. She's being taken to a subterranean chamber just near the Porticalina Gate. It's a sealed tomb, basically.
Where she will be left with just enough provisions to technically absolve the state of murder.
A small lamp, some bread, water, milk, and oil.
That's it. The judgment is then left to the gods, sealed away from the eyes of man. It is a shocking, almost theatrical display of Rome's willingness to sacrifice its most sacred figures to restore order.
It is. But here's the paradox. This is the twist that just pulls you deep into the legal and political world of Rome. Amelia wasn't some powerless victim. The woman being carried silently to be buried alive had, just days before, been granted rights and privileges and a legal status that the wives of senators or the mothers of generals couldn't even dream of.
She was legally autonomous in a world that was defined top to bottom by male legal control.
And that's the real mission of this deep dive. We're not looking at a simple story of oppression. We're confronting a paradox, a system that deliberately elevates a woman to an incredible height of privilege, makes her sancta-sacred and untouchable.
Only to keep the right to drop her into absolute vulnerability.
Yes. And often for, let's be honest, overtly political reasons. We have to move past the easy labels of empowerment versus subjugation and really look at how Rome engineered its most sacred women to be its most effective ritual sacrifices.
Exactly. We've pulled together historical accounts, fragments of judicial records, and transcripts focusing on that pivotal 114 BC trial. We're looking at the rules that govern the Vestal cult. And our goal is to really understand what kind of power can exist only on the condition of permanent, absolute constraint.
And what do these horrific punishments tell us about the political stresses that were tearing the Republic apart? It's a journey into the absolute heart of Roman faith and Roman fear. Prepare to have your understanding of gender roles and religious authority in Rome completely challenged.
Because the Vestal Virgins were the ultimate exception that proved every single rule.
So let's start at the very beginning. The sacred mandate. We know the core duty was all about the eternal flame, but what was the absolute foundation of their existence?
Well, it was the maintenance of the sacred fire of Vesta. She was the goddess of the hearth of the home. And there were always 6 priestesses, always working in rotation, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It sounds simple.
It sounds simple, but for the Romans, this was the central pulsing heart of the city's continuity. The Vestals were literally the keepers of the foci publici, the public hearth of Rome.
And the belief was absolute. If that fire went out,
Rome would fall. It wasn't just symbolic for them. It was the literal life force of the state. Any interruption was a sign of divine catastrophe.
So this tradition, it goes way back.
All the way back. Tradition attributes the founding of the entire order to Numa Pompilius II, sort of semi-legendary king of Rome. So we're talking 8th or 7th century BC. This antiquity meant the Vestals were the absolute bedrock of Roman religious law, the Enisis Divinum. This wasn't some minor peripheral cult. This was the foundation that the whole res publica was built on.
Okay, so if the survival of the entire state depends on 6 women, the criteria for choosing them must have been incredibly strict.
Ruthlessly defined. Let's get into that selection process because it really defines the kind of purity and power they were meant to embody.
First up, the age.
The age was critical. Candidates were chosen between 6 and 10 years old.
So young.
incredibly young. And it was crucial that they were prepubescent. They had to represent a pure, physical, chronological state before womanhood, before fertility, before the complications of legal marriage and sexuality could, muddy their sacred status.
And their family status was just as important, right? It defined the power structure they were pulled from.
Oh, absolutely. In the early republic, they were restricted to patrician families, the highest of the high aristocracy. Later, when they started admitting plebeians, the family still had to be unimpeachably respectable.
What did that mean? Respectable.
Both parents had to be alive, married to each other through the proper sacred rites, and the girl herself had to be, in the eyes of Roman law, physically and mentally perfect.
No impairments, no defects.
None. This was about selecting the absolute, pristine elite to serve the state.
And the selection itself was called the captio, that word. It's fascinating. It translates to taking or capture.
And that's exactly what it was. It wasn't a job application. It was a state seizure.
Who did the seizing?
The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Later on, this role was taken by the emperor himself. He had the authority. 20 eligible girls might be presented, and he would choose one, sometimes by lot, sometimes just by exercising his religious prerogative.
And we have historical examples of this.
We do. Licinia, for example, one of the women involved in that 114 BC trial we mentioned, she was taken at age 7, literally plucked from her father's house on the Palatine Hill and relocated directly to the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, in the Forum.
So that moment of captio, that taking, it triggered an immediate and profound legal transformation. This is the first real sign of their paradoxical status.
This is the absolute key legal detail. The second she was chosen, the girl was legally freed from her father's power. The patria potestas.
And that was everything in Roman society.
It was the bedrock of society. Every other Roman citizen, male or female, remained under their paterfamilia's legal control until he died. For a woman, that control just transferred to her husband when she got married.
So a normal Roman woman, even a wealthy one, if she inherited a fortune, she couldn't actually manage that money or sell property without a male guardian's consent.
Precisely. And this is where the Vestal system is just revolutionary. By severing the patria potestas, the Vestal became legally sui juris under her own law.
At age 7.
At age 7. While other women might, if they were lucky, achieve this status much later in life, maybe after their father and husband had died, the Vestal got it from day one of her service. She belonged to no man. She lived entirely outside the framework of domestic patriarchal control.
And this autonomy was reflected immediately in her new identity, right?
Absolutely. The induction ritual was very specific. The Pontifex Maximus would take her hand and say the formula, "I take you a martyr to be a Vestal priestess."
A martyr, meaning beloved.
Beloved, yes.
Ah.
A term of respect and affection. She literally shed her birth name, her family identity, for this new sacred identity devoted solely to the state.
And her appearance, especially her hair, reflected this liminal kind of unsettling status.
The sequins. The 6 braids wound carefully around her head. This was the only hairstyle she was allowed to wear.
And outside the Vestal cult, that style was only worn by
brides
well,
on their wedding day.
wow.
Think about that. A Vestal, sworn to a life of chastity, wears the hairstyle of a married woman for 30 years straight. She's permanently occupying this space between being a daughter and being a wife, between maidenhood and motherhood. She's perpetually suspended in a transitional state.
So the state basically institutionalized a sort of sacred, perpetual girlhood. It removed the need for marriage, but at the same time, it granted the legal rights you'd normally only associate with a high-status male citizen.
That's a very powerful way to put it. But, despite the honor, we know families resisted this. You mentioned Augustus earlier. Why would patrician families try to dodge this draft if it was such a high honor?
Because you're giving up your daughter for 30 years. That's 10 years learning, 10 performing the duties, and 10 teaching the next generation. 30 years where she isn't having children or, crucially, making marital alliances.
Which for the elite was everything.
Everything. Daughters were critical tools for cementing political and economic power through marriage. A Vestal daughter was a net loss to the family dynasty.
So families would use political influence, legal tricks, anything to avoid the selection. It actually became such a problem during the shift to the empire that Augustus had to publicly shame the elite.
Right. He said he would have offered his own granddaughter if she had been eligible.
Trying to guilt them back into their religious duty. That reluctance really highlights the intense societal cost of this unique sacred autonomy.
So this brings us to the actual powers they wielded. Because this wasn't just theoretical. It translated into tangible, everyday authority that, like we said, no other woman in Rome had.
Right, let's go back to the legal revolution, because it's worth hammering this home. We've talked about freedom from patria potestas, but what did that mean for her, her bank account?
It meant total economic sovereignty.
Yes, she could own property land, slaves, city houses in her own name, and crucially, she could sell that property. She could write and execute a legal will without getting permission from a male guardian, a tutor.
That is completely revolutionary. A typical Roman woman, no matter how rich her family, was legally fenced in.
Exactly. Even with vast wealth, she needed a male guardian to sign off on major transactions. The whole system was designed to keep assets under male control.
But a Vestal could walk into a negotiation, buy a vineyard, sell an apartment block, all based on her own decision. She was a fully independent economic actor.
A status that some Roman men struggled to achieve, depending on their own family situation. And this wasn't just about personal wealth. It let them become powerful civic patrons. We have inscriptions that show Vestals using their independent fortunes to fund public works or donate to temples.
So their financial decisions directly impacted the city.
They shaped the urban landscape. Beyond property, though, her actual person was literally inviolable. We have to really appreciate this concept of sacrosanctity.
Sacrosanctity.
Yeah.
It was the highest form of legal protection the state could offer.
It's the same protection given to the tribunes of the people. The tribunes were there to protect the rights of the plebeians, and their bodies were deemed sacred, untouchable.
So anyone who physically harmed or even just obstructed a Vestal
Could be summarily executed. It was a capital offense. No trial needed. Her robes were basically a permanent suit of legal armor. They put her outside the reach of common violence and law.
and you could see this status in how she moved around the city.
Yes. When a Vestal was walking through Rome, she was preceded by a lictor. Now, a lictor was a symbol of raw magisterial authority. He's the guy carrying the fasces.
The bundle of rods and the axe, the symbol of the magistrate's power to punish.
Right. So by giving a lictor to a Vestal, Rome was giving her the same public deference, the same visible symbol of authority as a consul or praetor. In her public movements, she had the status of a top magistrate.
That's an incredibly powerful image. A woman commanding the physical authority of a magistrate right in the middle of the forum. And socially, their honor was off the charts.
The best seats, always. Front and center at the Colosseum, at the Circus Maximus, at the theater.
In a society that was so hierarchical, where your seat literally defined your status, being front row in full view of everyone just confirmed their elite, exceptional place in the world.
They were living, breathing symbols of Rome's religious health and prosperity.
Okay, but the truly, truly breathtaking example of their power, the one that makes everyone just stop and go, wait, what? Is the power of the pardon.
The power to overturn a state-sanctioned death sentence. By complete accident.
Explain that.
If a Vestal, just going about her day, traveling through the streets, happened to cross paths with a condemned criminal being led to his execution, that man was immediately pardoned. Full stop.
On the spot.
On the spot. It was law, not just a nice custom. The only requirement was that the Vestal had to swear the meeting was accidental.
I have to stop you there. So a Roman court, after weeks of testimony ratified by a magistrate, hands down a death sentence. And a random Vestal, because she was on her way to the market, can just override the entire judicial system.
That is how profound their sacral status was. It was a tangible, active demonstration that her purity and her connection to Vesta outweighed even the state's need for justice or retribution.
So in that moment, the Vestal was more authoritative than the executioner, the judge, and the magistrate combined.
She was. It shows you that in Rome, when it came down to it, religious law often trumped civil law.
And this clout extended into the political and judicial spheres. In court, their role was just as extraordinary.
They could give testimony without swearing an oath.
Which everyone else had to do.
Everyone. From the highest general to the lowest slave, you had to swear an oath, usually to Jupiter, to guarantee you were telling the truth. If you lied, you faced divine punishment. But a Vestal's word was just assumed to be true.
She was considered legally incapable of lying.
Because of her sacred purity. Can you imagine the way her testimony would carry in a trial?
So they weren't just witnesses, they were effectively infallible witnesses. And beyond the courts, they were the keepers of state secrets.
The deep secrets, yes. Their sanctuary, the Pinus Vestae, was this underground vault that housed not just the sacred palladium, but also essential state documents. The wills of emperors, the official texts of treaties, major financial records, they were all entrusted to the Vestals.
Them.
Because their neutral, sacrosanct status made them the safest repository in Rome. They were above the political fray.
And in the volatile late Republic, sources like Cicero actually describe them actively mediating between hostile political factions.
They did. When you have figures like the Gracchi brothers causing upheaval, or Marius and Sulla waging civil war, these hostile politicians who trusted absolutely no one, not their own allies, not their clients, they trusted the Vestals.
To carry messages or negotiate a truce.
Their sacred neutrality was their currency of influence. It allowed them to shape political outcomes from completely outside the formal system of the Senate and the Assembly.
Which brings us back to that amazing anecdote of Claudia in 143 BC. It's the clearest evidence we have of a woman actively using her sacred status to override male political power.
It's an incredible story. Claudia's relative, Claudius Pulcher, had won a military victory, but the Senate, for purely political reasons, denied him a triumph.
The ultimate military honor.
So he decided to hold one anyway in defiance of the Senate. When a tribune of the plebs tried to physically block the procession, using his own magisterial power to stop the chariot, Claudia, who was a serving Vestal, intervened.
She just threw herself onto the chariot.
Placed her body right between the dissenting tribune and her relative on the chariot. And because she possessed sacrosanctity, the tribune was paralyzed. He could not physically touch her, he could not remove her, without instantly facing a capital charge himself.
So her legal immunity acted as a shield for him.
A human shield, yes. The Senate's political decision was completely nullified by a Vestal's religious authority. The triumph went ahead. That's not just influence, that is tangible, direct, immediate political power. It's hard to think of a clearer example of female agency defying the Senate's will right in the heart of Rome.
So we've established this reality. These women had truly unprecedented power. They were economic sovereigns, legal superiors, political players. And that fact makes the condition of that power the absolute necessity of permanent chastity, all more fragile and ultimately terrifying.
And that transition from this supreme privilege to a ritualized death is the darkest irony of the whole Vestal system. All that power, all of it, hinged on one single requirement for 30 years.
Absolute, unyielding chastity.
And the crime for violating that vow was incestum.
Which wasn't just, a moral failing. It was an act of sacrilege so profound that the Romans believed it polluted the entire city. It broke the Pax Deorum.
The peace with the gods. And when the Pax Deorum was broken, divine anger would manifest. Military defeats, plagues, crop failures, terrible omens. The guilt had to be purged.
But the execution itself presented this huge theological problem.
A huge problem. Because they believed that spilling the blood of a Vestal would pollute the city even further. They had to find a way to kill her without technically killing her.
And the solution they came up with, which the historian Plutarch details with just chilling clarity, was one of the most psychologically and physically cruel punishments of the ancient world.
Duo vivos in terram defodito. Burial alive.
The ritual itself was just meticulously designed. It seems like it was meant to inflict the maximum psychological trauma while keeping up this veneer of religious purity.
It was. The convicted Vestal would be stripped of her white robes and dressed in the clothes of a corpse. Specifically, the dress worn by women being prepared for burial.
Then she was placed on that covered litter, unable to see out, and carried through the silent, grief-stricken city.
And the silence was mandatory. It amplified the horror, and it ensured the ritual kept its religious solemnity. This was not supposed to be the spectacle of a common execution.
The destination was the Campus Celeratus, the wicked field, near the Porticalina Gate. And there, an underground chamber was prepared.
Usually described as a narrow cell with a ladder leading down into it.
Let's talk about the provisions they placed inside, because this detail is the ultimate horrifying technicality.
Inside the chamber, they placed the bare necessities. A small burning lamp with some oil, a plain bed, a single loaf of bread, and a pitcher of water and milk.
And these provisions were crucial.
They were. They were placed there before she was led down. They were intended to absolve the Romans of the guilt of murdering a sacred person, either by starvation or by direct violence.
It's a masterful piece of legalistic maneuvering.
It is. They're basically saying, we haven't killed her, we have just removed her from human society. If she is truly innocent, Vesta will rescue her.
The judgment is left to the gods.
Precisely. Once she descended the ladder, the Pontifex Maximus would step back, avert his gaze, and say a prayer. Then the chamber was sealed. A huge amount of earth was immediately heaped over the entrance until the ground was completely level and no trace of the opening remained.
She was literally removed from the world of the living and placed in the world of the dead, judged by the earth itself.
The sheer horror of it, it's not just the death, but the absolute removal of all hope and all human contact.
Just the knowledge that you are suffocating or dying of thirst, alone, in the dark, under the weight of the very city you were sworn to protect. It's a level of horror that's really difficult to grasp.
And that horrific fate was the constant, ever-present condition of their privilege. It was the price of their autonomy.
And it's so important to understand that these horrific rituals were not random events. Vestal trials were extremely rare, and they almost always clustered around these moments of severe existential crisis for Rome.
They functioned as a very visible, very politically convenient form of ritualized scapegoating.
You see them during the darkest days of the Second Punic War, after the catastrophic defeat at Cannae. You see them during the violent political upheavals of the late Republic and during periods of imperial instability.
The state only reached for this ultimate weapon when the Pax Deorum was demonstrably, terrifyingly broken.
And that 114 BC crisis, with Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, is the central, most detailed case study of this mechanism at work.
The anxiety in Rome at that time was immense. Militarily, they were really struggling against the Germanic tribes, the Cimbrian Teutones, who were beginning this terrifying migration south. It was seen as an existential threat to Italy itself.
And at home, political tensions between the different factions were escalating very, very quickly.
Then came the signal, the sign of divine displeasure.
The prodigy.
Yes. A nobleman's daughter was killed by lightning. For the Romans, being struck by lightning was a direct, furious message from Jupiter himself. Something was terribly wrong, and that something had to be a religious failure. The haruspices, the priests who interpreted these omens, pointed directly at the Vestals.
So an investigation began into incestum. And what's fascinating is that the original accusation came from a slave.
Which highlights just how extreme the crisis was felt to be. Under normal Roman law, a slave's testimony against a free citizen, especially an elite Vestal, was either inadmissible or highly, highly suspect.
But not here.
Not here. In matters concerning the safety of the state and the pollution of the sacred rites, all the normal rules were suspended.
So the initial trial goes before the Pontifical College, Rome's highest religious authority. What was their verdict?
The college deliberated, and they convicted Aemilia, but they acquitted the other two, Licinia and Marcia. And that judgment represented the college's traditional authority. They investigated, they found one guilty person, and they sought to restore order. Case closed, from a religious standpoint.
But the people were not satisfied.
Not at all. The underlying crises, the military threat, the political infighting hadn't gone away, which meant the gods must still be angry. And this is where you see politics just spectacularly override religious authority.
But yeah.
Popular dissatisfaction, which was probably being fanned by political maneuvering, forced the Senate to act. They set up a special judicial commission, an extraordinary court, led by the consul Lucius Cassius Longinus.
And this court effectively overrode the religious verdict of the Pontifical College.
An action that was itself almost unprecedented. You have the state judiciary directly challenging the absolute authority of the priesthood.
And the outcome of this special court was predictably much harsher.
The scope of the inquiry was broadened. Cassius Longinus, maybe pressured by politicians who saw the Vestals as a convenient distraction from their own failures, found all three Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, guilty.
All three were buried alive.
All three. And what's more, their alleged lovers were savagely beaten to death in the public square. The message was unmistakable. Total purification is required, no matter the cost.
And if you look at the evidence that the sources give us, it seems incredibly flimsy.
Flimsy at best. Cicero and others imply there was no specific proof of any sexual misconduct. The conviction seems to have rested on circumstantial evidence.
Like what?
Like, young men had been observed visiting the house of the Vestals, or that the women had been seen engaging in friendly conversation with men at public festivals.
They were convicted of being too friendly with men.
Essentially, yes. They failed to uphold the visible, austere separation that was demanded of them, and in a time of crisis, that was enough to constitute pollution when the state needed a scapegoat. The actual evidence was irrelevant, the verdict was necessary.
This just perfectly highlights the function of the pharmakoi, the ritual scapegoats. Their guilt wasn't the point.
Their necessary public destruction was the point. The Vestals were the ultimate high-status sacrifice. When Rome was suffering a profound crisis, it needed to offer something monumental to the gods to restore that Pax Deorum. The death of an ordinary person just wouldn't cut it.
The purification required a spectacular, high-value offering.
And this brings us to that dark truth we mentioned at the start. Their privilege made them more effective sacrifices.
Explain that.
Think about it. Why give them property rights, magisterial protection, and unrivaled social honor? It wasn't just for religious dignity. It was because the higher they stood, the greater the symbolic weight of their fall.
So the system deliberately created these women of unprecedented legal and social standing.
So that when it was politically expedient, that power could be dramatically, visibly, and ritually taken away. Their demise served as a public spectacle of punishment that convinced a panicked population that Rome had finally done enough to appease its furious gods.
And you see this pattern of political targeting repeated under the empire. Domitian's moral crusades are a key example.
Oh, absolutely. Domitian was obsessed with reinforcing traditional Roman morality, and he used the Vestal trials as a tool of political and social control. In 90 A.D., he targeted Cornelia, who was the Vestal Maxima, the chief Vestal.
On trumped-up charges.
Completely. She was convicted and buried alive without anything resembling a proper trial, which showed that even their previously sacrosanct legal protections could be just dismissed out of hand when an emperor decided he needed a convenient victim to demonstrate his power and his moral rigor.
The consistent thread across centuries seems to be this. Whenever Rome's survival was in question, the system turned on its most privileged women.
It used their exceptional status as the mechanism for its own purification and political distraction.
We focus so much on the drama of the selection and the horror of the punishment, but we have to spend some time on the daily reality, the thousands and thousands of hours that actually define their 30 years of service.
The lived experience, yeah.
They lived in the Atrium Vesti, the House of the Vestals, which was right in the Roman Forum, next to the Temple of Vesta. It was communal living, an institution housing 6 women, ranging from age 7 to their late 30s.
And it was at the absolute epicenter of Roman political life. The architecture of the house itself speaks to their unique status. It was a grand structure. It had its own elaborate courtyard, bathing facilities, private rooms. It reflected their wealth and honor.
But it was also physically walled off from the city,
symbolizing their separation from the normal life that they were there to protect.
and their ritual duties were just relentless, centered on the fire. If that fire went out, even by accident.
The responsible Vestal faced harsh discipline. The lightest punishment was being whipped by the Pontifex Maximus, often in the dark with a special rod. That was for a simple lapse in diligence.
And if it was judged to be something more.
If the lapse was seen as a consequence of impurity, say the fire went out repeatedly, or it happened to coincide with a military defeat, well, that immediately raised the specter of incestum. The pressure was just immense, constant.
But their sacred labor went far beyond just tending the fire. We have to talk about the mola salsa.
The mola salsa, the salted meal, it was central to almost every single Roman religious rite. It was this coarse mixture of roasted spelt, grain, and salt, and it was prepared only by the Vestals.
They were the only ones allowed to make it.
The only ones. They had to hand grind the spelt, ensure the grain was ritually pure, salt it using these very specific rites.
So why does this one specific foodstuff matter so much?
Because the mola salsa was sprinkled on every public and private sacrifice across the entire Roman world.
Every single one.
Every single one. From the offerings made by the emperor down to the simplest family hearth ritual. This meant that the Vestals, through their specialized labor, were literally linked to every single act of Roman piety. Their hands touched the source material of every prayer for prosperity and survival.
So if the mola salsa was polluted,
Then every single religious rite across Rome was polluted. That is an immense daily grinding responsibility.
and on top of that, they were guarding the most profound state secrets, the sacred objects in the Pinus Vesti.
Yes. The most famous, of course, was the Palladium. This small, ancient image, supposedly brought from Troy by Aeneas himself.
And the legend was that the survival of Rome hinged on the Palladium's preservation.
And only the Vestals were allowed to see it. Hostile generals, inquiring senators, even the Pontifex Maximus himself was forbidden from entering that inner sanctum.
The secrecy around the Palladium is fascinating. Ancient accounts, even from historians who were contemporaries of the later cult, give these wildly conflicting descriptions of what it even looked like.
Which just reinforces the point. Since no one outside the cult ever saw it, the descriptions became mythological, contradictory. Some said it was a bronze figure of Minerva, others said it was something completely non-representational. The power of the Palladium wasn't in its form, it was in the Vestal's exclusive sacred access to it. They were the singular conduit between Rome and its ultimate promise of survival.
Okay, so let's think about the human element inside those walls. For all the formality, it was still 6 women living together for decades.
A unique, isolated community. Think about the institutional dynamics. You have the Vestal Maxima, the chief Vestal, wielding authority over the younger ones. You have the inevitable personality clashes, the politics of close quarters living.
All under the constant crushing knowledge that any mistake, any rumor, could lead to a horrific end.
And sources often pointed to a visible sign of this stress, this constant observation.
The walk.
The walk. Ancient authors noticed that some Vestals developed this distinctive, gait-rapid, short steps, eyes fixed straight ahead, looking neither left nor right. It's the physical manifestation of institutional paranoia.
They knew the eyes of the city, and the gods were always on them.
They had to appear austere, inaccessible, utterly focused, lest the slightest misstep lead to an accusation.
So what about those who made it, who survived the full 30 years? The system said they were free to leave and marry.
They were. They were released from their vows, usually in their late 30s or early 40s, with all their accumulated wealth and their independent legal status. They were perfectly positioned to make a good marriage.
But very few actually did.
Very few. The sources suggest that having lived for so long outside the normal social structure, they found it difficult to integrate.
They were past the traditional age for a first marriage, and maybe their status was just too daunting for potential husbands.
It was likely both. And think about it. They were accustomed to absolute financial and legal autonomy. Getting married would mean surrendering that, returning to the control of a husband.
So what did they do instead?
Most of them just lived out their lives independently. They used their wealth to become patrons, often supporting younger Vestals or funding local temples. They were these complete anomalies. High status, wealthy, unmarried, and legally free women in a society built to prevent that exact combination from existing.
We have to focus on the story of Junia Torquata. She completed her full 30 years.
She did. Junia Torquata served from about 30 AD to 60 AD. She survived the reigns of Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, a period of intense imperial instability.
And she retired and lived for another 2 decades.
Never married, maintained her independent status. When she died, her family, her nephews and great-nephews, they erected these inscriptions to honor her. But she wasn't honored as a wife or a mother or even a civic patron. She was honored primarily as Vestalis Maxima.
So even in death, she was defined by her sacred separation.
A respected curiosity. A woman who defied all the normal categories of Roman womanhood. Her life really illustrates that the only path to genuine, lasting autonomy for a Roman woman was this permanent, sacred, and incredibly dangerous separation from the roles that society demanded of everyone else.
And so now we have to synthesize this. This is the ultimate contradiction that defined the Vestal Virgins. We've established that the system was, in many ways, brutally oppressive. To young girls, it forced chastity on them, demanded 30 years of service under threat of a truly horrific death.
And yet at the same time, it was profoundly empowering. It offered legal rights that were unmatched by any other woman in their society. It allowed them to wield financial control, political influence, magisterial protection.
The two realities are just inseparable. The power was predicated on the oppression.
Yes. Their entire function was to act as these exceptional, high-status tokens of female capability. They had power, but only on the condition of permanent, total sacrifice. The sacrifice of marriage, of family, of motherhood, and ultimately of their personal safety.
And this is the core insight that needs to be understood.
Yeah.
Their power did not undermine the patriarchal structure of Rome. It absolutely reinforced it.
Exactly. Rome could point to the Vestals and say, look, women are honored and powerful in our society, but that honor was entirely conditional on their permanent liminal status.
By isolating these 6 women and granting them this conditional power, Rome successfully contained the entire concept of female authority.
They proved that women could be powerful, but only if they gave up the central reproductive domestic roles that defined every other woman.
It creates this powerful exception that just confirms the rule for everyone else. If you want wealth, agency, and influence, You have to sacrifice your conventional womanhood and remain perpetually available for state use, or, when crisis hits, for ritual sacrifice.
Their autonomy was state-managed, and it was revocable. The moment an accusation was made, that sacrosanctity that protected them just evaporated, leaving them utterly exposed. They were the ultimate example of state-granted privilege being strategically leveraged against the individual when the political environment demanded it.
And this system, after more than 1,000 years of keeping that fire alive, finally succumbed to a shift in imperial politics.
Yes. In 394 AD, the Christian emperor Theodosius, who was aiming to consolidate Christianity as the one true state religion, officially disbanded the order. The Vestal Virgins were expelled from the Atrium Vestae.
And the sacred flame was extinguished.
Deliberately.
An act of monumental historical and religious defiance, extinguishing a fire that had burned continuously since before the foundation of the Republic, all based on the belief that putting it out would bring an end to Rome. And here is the profound final irony.
Rome did not fall when the eternal flame went out. The city endured for another century in the west, and the empire continued for another 1,000 years in the east.
So theological justification for their entire existence
Was revealed in the end to be a myth. Generations of women had dedicated their entire lives and sometimes faced unimaginable deaths to maintain it. So we conclude this deep dive with the enduring memory of these women. Powerful and powerless, honored and used, privileged and endangered. The story of the Vestals really forces us to grapple with a history that just refuses to fit into simple categories of hero or victim.
Their legacy compels us to look beyond these simple narratives of virtue or oppression, to ask a much harder question. What does it truly mean when a society grants power, but only under the condition of impossible constraints?
That is the challenging question we're left with. Can power that is granted only by demanding permanent, total sacrifice, the sacrifice of family, marriage, personal autonomy, can that truly be counted as genuine freedom?
Or does the very existence of these exceptional women just serve to reinforce the constraints placed on the majority?
The greater the spectacle of the exception, the firmer the bounds of the norm.
And we really encourage you to reflect on that distinction. Look around our modern society. Where do we still see exceptional status granted to certain groups or to certain individuals, but only on the condition that they remain liminal or that they give up something essential? And in doing so, they just reinforce the constraints placed on everyone else.
The enduring memory of Aemilia, Licinia, Marcia, and Junia Torquata teaches us that agency and exploitation are often two sides of the same highly polished, sacred coin. The price of their privilege was sometimes their life, ensuring that the system that created them could always protect itself.